those mysterious leaks in the Nord Stream pipelines, sabotage.
Suspect has not yet been identified.
And this comes at a tipping point time for Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine.
In January 1982, President Ronald Reagan approved a CIA plan to sabotage the economy of the Soviet Union with covert, flawed software that contained intentional malfunctions. Now, it was the height of the Cold War. America and the West faced a hostile Soviet Union. The tension over nuclear arms was at its height, and the world was drawn into two very strong and apparently enduring blocs. According to the Farewell Dossier, an authenticated historical document about this joint CIA, FBI and Department of Defense operation, contrived computer chips would make their way into Soviet military equipment, flawed turbines were installed on a gas pipeline, and defective plans disrupted the output of chemical plants and a tractor factory. In his book, At the Abyss, An Insider's History of the Cold War, Thomas Reed said that the operation resulted in a huge explosion in a Siberian natural gas pipeline. So massive, both the explosion and the resulting fire were visible from space, which has special resonance with events today. Yeah, but not so fast. It turns out that the explosion was likely not caused by the operation. This was a time when the Soviet Union didn't actually use software systems in its pipeline control, and the 1982 pipeline explosion was actually a different pipeline and was caused by poor construction and the actions of a worker who responded to a leak by just increasing the pressure. That's important for historical accuracy, but the basics about the joint project were the same. It came at a time when the US was trying to block Western Europe from importing Soviet natural gas. Whatever the arguments and the counter-arguments, the fact was that the US took active and covert steps to disrupt gas supply, to hit the Soviet Union's hard currency earnings from the West. And of course, since then, Russian government hacker groups have often targeted crucial infrastructure in Western countries in their own part. For instance, the notorious Sandworm group, which I covered in a previous video. So, whatever else we bring to the question of what did or didn't happen with the Nord Stream pipeline, one thing we shouldn't bring to the table is a presumption that any side should be ruled out from the beginning. And for all the fact that the focus has now rather shifted to the explosion that hit the Kerch Bridge between Crimea and Russia, the bombing of the pipeline is still actually the most significant if we're looking beyond admittedly potent symbolism, because the economic damage caused by the pipeline blast could push parts of Europe into recession as deep as the one in 2009, and it signifies an important shift in terms of focus. So what are the facts of what happened? In the waters off the coast of the Danish island of Bornholm, gas started bubbling to the surface in extraordinary quantities. At around 2 a.m. on the 26th of September, German engineers saw a drop in the pressure of the gas held in the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Even though it wasn't in active use, the pipeline was filled with gas to maintain full pressure, so that it could begin operation if it was ever going to be needed again. The same day, the same problem was then seen with its twin pipeline, Nord Stream 1. The Danish Air Force located the major leaks in the sea, huge bubbling centres of activity that saw over 350,000 tonnes of the potent greenhouse gas methane released into the atmosphere. Danish geologists reported 2 large spikes on their seismographs that day, evidence the damage had been caused by large-scale explosions. Is there a chance it could have been an extraordinary accident? There was certainly some speculation about this. In the Canadian investment magazine, The Deep Dive, Braden Mack speculated that Germany could have been taking some of the gas from the pipeline, stealing it, in other words. And that might have prompted Russia to add air to the mix to maintain the pressure, while not adding more commercially valuable methane. Pure methane is not combustible, but mixed with air could have been a time bomb waiting to go off. Gas pipelines blow up all the time, he wrote. They're dangerous pieces of industrial infrastructure full of high-pressure hydrocarbons being handled by people who are human. This wasn't a view that caught much traction amongst the various investigating agencies. After all, such damage happened to both pipelines simultaneously and in the same stretch of water. The supposition of sabotage was universally agreed to be the most likely explanation. Denmark and Sweden concluded that these blasts involved up to half a ton of TNT planted 300 feet below the seabed, which stands in anyone's book as a non-trivial piece of sabotage. So yes, nearly everyone agreed that it had been deliberate. Now, agreeing on who did it, unsurprisingly, that has been less clear-cut. Everyone has denied responsibility. Many have stated their presumption that it was an action taken by Russia. So, for example, Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said that it was the next step of escalation of the situation in Ukraine. And Norway deployed its military to guard some of its own pipelines from similar attacks. But also many pushed back the other way and said that actually the United States had at least as good an incentive, and I certainly saw plenty of those in the comment section of a news video where I covered the event. Indeed, I was accused of supporting the mainstream media narrative, even though I didn't actually express an opinion, as I generally don't in the absence of concrete evidence. But it wasn't just YouTube commenters. A lot of others pointed the finger in the same direction, including some of those with large and highly engaged audiences.
Blowing up Nord Stream does not help Vladimir Putin. He would not do that. Why would he? But that doesn't mean that other countries wouldn't consider doing it. Joe Biden suggested on camera that he might take out these pipelines.
So let's look at the arguments and the counter-arguments. Why might it have been America? Why might it have been Russia? Understanding the arguments won't lead to definitive conclusions as to who did it, because we still don't have concrete evidence. The investigation is ongoing. But it will serve to understand both sides of the debate, because this at least is one instance in this conflict where it's prudent to listen to both. So what's the case for it being America that did this? The start is to raise doubt over whether it would have been in Putin's interest to do it.
Europe needs your energy, now more than ever with winter approaching. If you can't deliver that energy, then countries like Germany have no need to pay attention to what you want. Under these circumstances, there is no chance you would blow up Nord Stream 1 or 2.
So a straight commercial interest on the one hand, the pipeline has been built to be a major conduit of valuable resources to its largest market, and a strategic interest on the other hand, recognising that Putin is using energy to put pressure on Europe. Removing some of his ability to deliver that energy, should European countries cave into his demands, surely removes his leverage. Not only that, America had a direct interest in not allowing that to happen. Those European allies are put under such intense pressure as they head into winter, starved of Russian gas. Indeed, they might just cave. And America had been pushing from Trump to Biden for that not to be possible. As far as those convinced of this argument are concerned, the smoking gun comes from the words of the administration itself, starting indeed with the president, who in a joint press conference with the German Chancellor Scholz before the start of the war said this.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine. Again, then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will. I promise you we'll be able to do it.
When asked about the incident, Secretary of State Blinken managed to raise eyebrows by immediately going onto the line that this outcome was a tremendous opportunity for clean energy alternatives.
This is also a tremendous opportunity. It's a tremendous opportunity to once and for all remove the dependence on Russian energy, and thus to take away from Vladimir Putin the weaponization of energy as a means of advancing his imperial designs.
Now, there's a number of ways you could interpret those comments. The device that US actually used in the short term was sanctions, before eventually dropping them later on, which is what you would tend to presume was meant, not least because Biden's press conference was actually done standing alongside the leader of the country that would be targeted, Germany. If it had actually been taken as a threat of actual military or industrial sabotage, you'd have expected a vigorous response from Scholz there and then at the time. But that said, As the story which I led this video off with demonstrated, we shouldn't imagine such tactics are necessarily considered out of bounds. Some pointed out the fact that the strike happened around the same time as a new pipeline was being launched, providing gas between Norway and Poland, a venture that they speculated would do very well now that the competition was out of operation. And of course, the US has been selling liquefied natural gas to Europe as well to see them through the crisis, a commercial venture which some also suggested might be a motivating factor. Although, to be fair, President Biden has been getting some kickback domestically from the fact that LNG is being sold to Europe, when actually there's quite a demand for it within the United States. The one other component that people supporting this case tend to point to is, I think, somewhat weaker, which is the fact that an ex-minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski, tweeted a picture of the leak thanking the US. The fact that an ex-politician jumps to a conclusion doesn't tell you anything about what actually happened. There's no suggestion he has any inside information. It does support the argument that a number of people would see the US as having a solid enough interest that they might presume their involvement. So there's that. Even if they were wrong to presume it, it does show that at least it's not an entirely outlandish proposition. And of course, Russia has been quick to state that this is indeed what happened. Putin said, "It is hard to believe, but it is a fact that they, NATO, organised the blast on the Nord Stream international gas pipelines. No evidence was presented to support such categorical certainty, and since Russia claims categorical certainty about all sorts of things that are patently false, it's not really a contribution to the discussion that carries much weight." One circumstantial piece that some did highlight was the fact that a US aircraft was tracked flying over that part of the Baltic Sea a couple of hours after the explosion. The US Naval Forces Europe Africa Director of Public Affairs, Captain Tamara Lawrence, said that the aircraft was a US Navy P-8A Poseidon aircraft, which conducted a routine flight over the Baltic Sea unrelated to the incident. Alright, what about the case for the other side? The case for it having been the action of Putin and Russia. The argument here is that the move is entirely in line with Putin's war aims and approach, and the arguments to the contrary are erroneous. The Russian president has been placing his whole strategy of energy disruption on the principle that his own country and its people can better endure, or at least will be more compliant in their suffering, economic pain than the Europeans. A harsh winter with soaring gas prices and rampant inflation will boost populist challenges to existing governments, will bring citizens out onto the streets to protest. This will undermine support for Ukraine, and that will eventually turn the tide on the battlefield. Some describe it as a strategy of desperation in the face of solid battlefield losses. Others believe it's on firmer ground, but it is patently the strategy that is being followed. European gas prices have been dropping for the 4 days prior to the explosions. In their wake, those prices went back up by 20%. The argument that Putin wouldn't have damaged his own economic assets is wrong, it is argued, for two reasons. First, the Europeans have clearly committed irrevocably that they will move away from Russian gas as quickly as possible. So the economic value of the pipelines is extremely diminished. Given the actions of the last 6 months, it would take an extreme fantasist to think that the outcome of the economic pressure would be Europe deciding to simply cave in and embrace Russia as its energy partner of choice for the future. Secondly, Putin is conducting a war. Standard peacetime commercial logic has been suspended in anything that is central to advancing the war aims. After all, he's been willing to take action knowing it would lead to major sanctions, vast amounts of money is going into the equipment, the ammunition and all the rest of it. Compared to the countless billions Putin is sinking into this make or break, do or die war, the idea that the relatively minor cost of a couple of pipelines is remotely a factor just doesn't fit the current context, they say. Indeed, it's bizarre to 1 minute be pondering whether Putin might move to conduct a nuclear war, and then in the next breath suggest that the cost of a pipeline is going to be a factor in his equation. That new pipeline between Norway and Poland that was mentioned, that could be part of a provocation for Putin, rather than being part of a motive to damage Nord Stream. For one thing, it is a significantly lower capacity pipeline. It's expected to be running at capacity regardless of what was or what wasn't coming through Nord Stream 1. Indeed, commentators suggested that Putin was sending a signal that such infrastructure could be at risk next if Russia is backed into a corner. If Europe lost the Norway pipeline, it would be plunged into a very cold winter indeed. Others have suggested that the operational design of the action gives clues in itself. So Dr. David Kilcullen talks about the structure of what he calls liminal warfare, which is based on the existence of three thresholds: detection, attribution, and response. If you're below all of those thresholds, then you're engaged in clandestine activity. The damage you seek to do to your opponent should evade detection. It will do its damage, no one will ever know that it was caused deliberately. Or you could choose, depending on your objectives, to do something that will be detected. So, for example, a bomb goes off, but in such a way that attribution isn't possible, so nobody knows for sure who did it. The Nord Stream sabotage sits between those two, clearly detectable, but not attributable. Then you might be above the attribution threshold, but still below the level of certainty that can lead to response. In other words, it's fairly clear who's responsible, but the level of proof is not sufficient to be likely to base a formal response on. Strategy analyst Anders Puck Nielsen said that the operational design for this action created three significant impacts. It raised the general level of insecurity, it created ruptures amongst the Western alliance, and it created more uncertainty and hence higher costs in the energy market. All of those outcomes, he suggested, were damaging to America and its allies, beneficial to Russia. Had America or Ukraine or Poland been inclined to do this to make it impossible for Germany to turn back to Russian gas, they would have sought ways to do it, he argued, that remained below the detection threshold. That would have achieved all their objectives without the downsides. And it's worth noting, having started with that example from what America tried to do to a Soviet pipeline, that was exactly the nature of the operation they were engaged in. A software malfunction that they would introduce that would never be discovered would be written off as an accident. So that, to some degree, supports that proposition. Anders Puck Nielsen also highlighted one other factor arising from prospect theory, and it comes down to how countries in conflict tend to deal with risk. Generally speaking, we will take risks in order to win or to avoid losing, but it matters a lot more to us that we avoid losing. Generally, people, and this applies to the people that are heads of state, hate losing more than they like winning. And we see this in the current conflict. Putin is facing serious problems and unrest from the perception at home that the operation is failing. It's perceived that if his war fails, he will fall. In that situation, the theory posits, if we are winning, we will be more careful about taking risks. Why do novel and dangerous things that run the risk of changing a pre-existing momentum? However, if we're losing, then we will take much bigger risks in the hope that it can somehow turn things around. So he argued, yes, the United States didn't want Germany to be dependent on Russian gas. It had said so, but why would it choose this moment when gas isn't flowing, when its side seems to be winning, in order to take what would see a huge risk? Because hitting part German infrastructure would be a massive blow to the alliance if it were discovered. Such a high-profile action, the risks of detection, would have to be assessed as significant. Whereas for Putin, he said, he has his back to the wall, clearly taking sizable risks in other ways, such as the mobilization and the frequent talk about moving to nuclear war, the mere threat of which is a substantial risk. Hence, the operational design, he concluded, and the timing added significant weight to the contention that this was an action taken by Russia. So that's the essence of the two cases. Some of the other arguments, rogue actors from factions within states, or even environmental NGOs, I've heard someone speculate, those seem highly unlikely given the scale of the operation, because they simply wouldn't have had the resources and the logistical support to be able to pull it off. Even if it made sense to do it in terms of program design, which it's argued it doesn't. Now, I won't jump to any firm conclusions, so long as there's no solid evidence. It's not the same as suggesting that the logical cases being put forward are equally strong. I mean, I just don't think that they are. I think the current state of evidence, which can change, but the current state of evidence points significantly more to Russia than it does elsewhere. But I led this video with the history of America's own operation as a reminder. That's not the case because one side is inherently incapable of thinking of doing such a thing. We shouldn't always assume that countries are incapable of making bad strategic choices and doing things that are actually against their own interest. I mean, if Russia had followed a self-destructive course in this war because of errors of judgment, as it clearly has, let's not presume that others are immune to errors of judgment. And this matters. If Russia has started taking out critical infrastructure, it signals a shift to taking direct action to damage European countries in a way that could have profound consequences. Understanding what's really going on is really rather important. And that's why I've argued that key to understanding the war is understanding how Vladimir Putin, the person driving it, sees the world. Because he has a coherent worldview where all of this at least used to make sense, which is why I made a video looking at exactly that. You might want to watch that video next.